Hello guys, welcome to Dr. Night Stare. I know you guys come here to relax and take a nap. So before we go, please hit like and subscribe. By the way, also tell me what time and where you guys listening from. Alright then. Ethan felt the weight of his final year in Viridian City's university pressing down, a heavy cloak he'd been hiding under. His creative spirit, once a vibrant fire, had dwindled to embers, leaving him to spend his winter break aimlessly, losing hours to digital rabbit holes and the blank stare of a screen. He remembered when he'd built elaborate miniature cityscapes, when his online art community knew his handle well. What had become of him? December 30th. A cold snap in the air seemed to clear his head. He scrolled through an old art forum, seeing his past self's enthusiastic posts. A pang of something resembling purpose stirred within him. He grabbed his digital drawing tablet. Several half-formed concepts swirled in his mind. With a surprising surge of energy, he completed a quick sketch, a dynamic cityscape bathed in twilight. He'd post it tomorrow. He repeated a silent affirmation, a hopeful whisper for a fresh start. New year, new me. A soft tap against his apartment window made him pause. He turned, but the glass reflected only the dreary city lights. Nothing. Strange. He settled into bed. As consciousness began to slip away, he heard a distinct thump-thump from the hallway, echoing slightly in the quiet building. Probably a neighbor. After what felt like an age, he finally drifted into sleep. When he awoke, an unsettling awareness prickled at his skin. Someone was just outside his apartment door. A chilling presence he felt more than heard. It took long, agonizing minutes for him to gather the courage to rise from his bed and reach for the doorknob. It was Ethan, or a perfect, unsettling reflection of him. The figure sighed, his breath a visible puff in the cool air of the hallway. New year, new me, he intoned. The words a hollow echo of Ethan's own hope. What? The knot? Ethan burst into the room, roughly shoving Ethan aside. He moved with alarming speed, already at the desk, his hands flying across the keyboard, opening the art software and beginning to draw with furious intent. Part of Ethan imagined him as a boy consumed by a singular, intense purpose. Ethan lay sprawled on the floor. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs wouldn't respond. He strained to speak, but his tongue felt like a forgotten muscle. Why did this feel so agonizingly familiar? Then the floor dissolved beneath him. He was falling, plummeting into a swirling void the color of utter darkness, and there they were. More than a dozen of him. One was a still, infantile form with his eyes. Another, a paralyzed toddler with his unruly hair. Each was older than the last, until he saw him, himself exactly 1 year younger. And the understanding crashed over him, a cold wave of forgotten knowledge. They were all him, each one born at the stroke of a new year, rising from the void. He had walked into that Ethan's bedroom. When he touched him, he had thought he was erased, and then he had forgotten. He didn't believe any of them had a choice in being forgotten. The still body of his younger self glared at him with furious recognition. Perhaps he would do the same to the one who would come down here next, and the one after that too. And the one after one, after AFTER, AFTER. AFTER. He felt an unbearable weariness. Maybe he should simply sleep, with his eyes wide open, watching. Sarah, a once celebrated freelance writer, stared at the crumpled pages that littered the damp cellar floor. Her well of inspiration, once considered bottomless, had utterly dried up. She was on day 243, and the hulking man who held her captive would not accept blankness. She despised this place, a forgotten cellar beneath an old crumbling mill, where the only light from a cheap, flickering lamp cast long, grotesque shadows across the skeletal remains of other women. She had the freedom to move, not that she ever wanted to. The heavy trapdoor above creaked open, and the silhouette of a man filled the opening. Sarah glanced frantically back at her empty page, hoping, as if by some miracle, words had materialized. There was only the etched number, Night 243. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the wooden steps. Clud. Thunk. Victor descended, a high-pressure stunner in his thick hand, and settled onto a small stool in the center of the room. His eyes, small and unsettlingly childlike, peered at her from the gloom. She remembered another captive, way back on Night 1, who had nervously giggled, "He brings his work home." It was true. Victor, who had once worked at a rural meat processing plant, now used the same brutal tools on them. Sarah had witnessed the grisly end of that girl, and had begun to beg, then plead, then babble incoherently. Somehow, from that desperate slop of words, a story had emerged. Her savior. Victor had sat and listened as she spun her yarn, and like any good writer, she'd left it on a cliffhanger. Night 1 had guaranteed Night 2, and so it had continued, until now. I, Sarah stammered, her gaze fixed on nothing. Once upon a time, her voice trailed off, a whisper of a plea. She knew Victor hadn't softened, intermittently, new victims were still brought down, still butchered. Her stories were her only shield, and now it was gone. Victor stood, his vast frame ominous, the stunner slowly rising in his hand. "Wait," she shrieked, a raw, acidic surge of something primal erupting within her. "You," she spat, the venom in her voice making him halt. "You bald, corpulent, gutless, pathetic excuse for a man." He took a step, but she continued her tirade, a torrent of years of suppressed rage unleashed. "Let's talk about you, Victor, working all day in some dreary plant because you couldn't make it past elementary school. And at night, you drag women down here because you haven't had a flicker of desire since before President Bush. You weren't even abused, were you? Your father terrorized your brothers, but he thought you too dim-witted for even his cruelty to take root. Kill me. Because I'd rather be a cold corpse than spend another moment breathing the same air as the world's most pathetic failure." A peculiar expression twisted Victor's face. He swayed, then collapsed onto the dirt floor. A heart attack. He swayed, then collapsed onto the dirt floor. An aneurysm? The exact cause would baffle medical examiners later. But as Sarah, heart-pounding, climbed out of the oppressive cellar into the cool night air, she knew. After 243 nights of woven fantasies, it was the unvarnished truth that had finally claimed her captor. Propofol is the primary agent used in general anesthesia. As a biochemist, Mark Peterson had never really considered propofol in depth until a routine appendectomy became necessary. He'd been dealing with persistent discomfort, and the surgery was finally scheduled. Like anyone facing their first surgical procedure, Mark delved into researching the anesthesia process. He wanted to understand what would happen when he was put under. Initially, what he discovered was reassuring enough. However, certain characteristics of propofol struck him as peculiar. We all simply assume that during surgery, we remain oblivious because we're unconscious. And that's perfectly acceptable. Mark had no desire to be lucid on an operating table. But propofol doesn't merely induce sleep. It possesses another property, one that gave him considerable unease. Beyond rendering a patient unconscious, propofol also acts as an amnesiac. This means it causes forgetfulness. More precisely, it prevents the brain from encoding new memories altogether. Mark was certain he wasn't alone in contemplating the implications of this revelation. The question burrowed into his mind and refused to dislodge. What if anesthesia isn't what we universally believe it to be? What if, far from eradicating pain during surgery, it's merely a mechanism to ensure you have no recollection of the agony? He couldn't shake the image of himself strapped to a surgical table, conscious, fully aware, experiencing every sensation, while his brain silently failed to record any of it. An ordeal perfectly endured and perfectly obliterated. Naturally, the thought deeply disturbed him. The more he pondered it, the more it consumed him. A part of it was fear, but another significant part was professional curiosity. As a scientist, he craved a definitive answer, a real one, and there seemed to be no way to obtain it without putting himself at risk. But he was willing to conduct the experiment. You see, it wouldn't be particularly challenging to synthesize a compound that specifically interfered with propofol's memory encoding effect, leaving its other mechanisms untouched. In theory, he could create a drug that, if administered beforehand, would allow him to remember everything. If anesthesia functioned as everyone believed, the compound would have no discernible effect. He would simply be unconscious, and there would be nothing to recall. But if something else was transpiring, if consciousness persisted, he would know the truth. He rationalized that, as surgeries go, an appendectomy probably wasn't the worst. Painful, yes, but survivable. And if he did remember something, anything at all, it would undoubtedly be traumatic. Yet, it would also represent a scientific discovery of immense magnitude. He decided to take the gamble. With over a month before his scheduled surgery, Mark set to work mapping propofol's pathways and its impact on memory. He learned that its primary action stemmed from potentiating GABA-A receptors, which amplified chloride ion influx into neurons, leading to the hyperpolarization of postsynaptic membranes. In simpler terms, it effectively shut down the neuronal conditions required for memory formation. His objective was to craft a compound that bound to these very same receptors, but possessed a dramatically shorter half-life. It needed to last long enough to block propofol's amnesiac effect, but dissipate swiftly enough to allow normal memory function to resume. The timing would be absolutely crucial. He would need to ingest it shortly before the propofol was administered. That wasn't an insurmountable problem. He tested the compound on himself, meticulously measuring recall and tracking the duration of memory gaps after ingestion. After a week or two of refinement, he had something he was confident would work. The preliminary results were promising, and that, he told himself, was probably the most hazardous part. In all likelihood, he was in greater danger from ingesting his hastily concocted compounds than he ever would be from the anesthesia, regardless of its true mechanism. But he had cleared that hurdle and was anxiously prepared for his surgery. When the day finally arrived, he tucked a small glass vial containing his compound into his pocket and made his way to the regional medical center. Just before the attendants wheeled him into the surgical suite, he downed the liquid. There was no turning back now. The anesthesiologist hooked up his IV and instructed him to count backward from 10. Mark didn't think he made it past 6. The next thing he knew, he was awake, in a distinctly different room. He was still on a gurney, and, judging by the sensation around his lower abdomen, he was post-operation. But something was profoundly wrong. His wrists and ankles were strapped down. He struggled against his restraints, but couldn't budge. Soon, though, a man entered the room. He didn't look like medical staff. He wore casual clothes, jeans, and a plain shirt, and carried a sleek digital tablet under his arm. "Mr. Peterson," he began, "I'm a technician for. I'm censoring the name of the company for my safety, but it's a big tech company that you would recognize, and we have acquired the biometric data rights from this medical facility." Mark didn't comprehend what that meant and was more than a little freaked out. So, he returned to struggling feebly against his restraints. "Mr. Peterson, please. Your appendectomy was a success. But if you continue like this, you may damage your incision." Mark tried to calm himself, but his heart rate was through the roof, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. "What is this?" he demanded. "I'm just going to collect some data from you, and then you'll be on your way. Not to worry. You won't remember a thing." The man placed his tablet down on his lap, and with a few taps, a device on a long articulated arm swiveled from the wall and hovered above Mark. The device whirred and flashed as it rotated, projecting a grid pattern over his body. "First, we'll do some ocular mapping." The device moved within inches of his face. He tried to turn away, but something held his head firmly in place. Tiny arms emerged from the device and grasped onto each of his eyelids, holding them open. The machine emitted a series of flashes, whirs, and beeps as it hovered over his eyes. "Now we'll collect a sample of vitreous humor." Mark didn't know what that term meant when the technician said it, but soon discovered, to his utter horror, that it was the fluid inside his eye. A small door on the device hissed open, and a long, gleaming needle approached his eye with a metallic glint. He screamed. He struggled. But ultimately, he stared helplessly as the needle pierced his eye. The pain was excruciating. Another beep, and the needle retracted. On to gastrointestinal data. The man spoke with such chilling casualness, as if he had performed this hundreds of times. He probably had. A long cylindrical apparatus emerged from the device, and without warning, rammed itself into Mark's mouth. He could feel the cold metal snaking down his throat, muffling his screams. It felt like that thing was inside him for an eternity. And when it emerged, it was covered in clear, viscous goop. We got your blood while we were in there. Time for bone marrow. The device hovered over his right leg, just out of his range of sight. He heard the unmistakable sound of a drill whiz to life and felt a shooting pain erupt in his thigh. All right. Almost done, the man said. Just one more thing. Now we get to the part that I'm not even comfortable sharing anonymously. I'll leave it to your imagination. All right, Mr. Peterson, all done. Time to go back to sleep. When you wake up, this will all be gone. Mark knew he was wrong. So, as he was drifting back to unconsciousness, he had to ask, what's this all for? With all this data, we'll be able to show you some killer ads. Mark woke up in a normal post-op ward. All the doctors and nurses acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Those ads had better be worth it. Sarah sat in her car on a quiet street, the engine idling, and called her mother. Eleanor answered with a careful, questioning tone. Are you okay? Sarah stared at the empty asphalt ahead, her headlights illuminating nothing. I'm not, she admitted, but I will be. After a pause, she continued, I'm done running. I'm done waiting for him to decide what happens next. Eleanor's breathing immediately quickened. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice laced with fear. I'm ending this tonight, Sarah stated. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. End it how? Sarah revealed the location he'd mentioned, an old, isolated cabin in the woods that had sat empty for years, a place he'd spoken of as if it were still his. Eleanor gasped. Oh God, she whispered. Please, you don't have to. I need you to listen, Sarah insisted, her voice firm. I'm not asking for permission. I just need you to know where I am. Eleanor began to plead, telling her to wait, to call the police again, offering to come with her. I love you, Sarah said, feeling the weight of the words. I love you too, Eleanor's voice broke. Sarah hung up, afraid that another word might make her turn back. The moment Sarah arrived at the cabin, she saw them. Bright red, blue, and yellow balloons bobbed gently, tied neatly to the old wooden post where a mailbox once stood, looking cheerful and utterly out of place against the dim forest. Every light in the cabin was blazing. Sarah sat in her car across the dirt track for a long time, the engine humming, trying to convince herself that if she waited, something would change. It didn't. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the living room looked as though a party supply store had exploded. Streamers hung from the low ceiling. Balloons clustered in the corners. Confetti lay scattered across the wooden floor, untouched, as if it had been thrown hours ago and left exactly where it landed. In the center of the room, a dining table had been dragged forward, 2 place settings, 2 glasses, and a cake. White frosting, blue trim, candles already pressed into the top. Her name, Sarah, was written neatly across it. Sarah's hand automatically went to her phone. She didn't even look at the screen as she hit record. The camera opened, then froze. The screen dimmed, flickered once, and went completely black. Not off, just dead. She pressed the power button. Nothing. Held it down. Tried again. Still nothing. Panic began to creep up her spine. That won't work, a voice said behind her. Sarah spun around. Officer Miller stood near the hallway entrance, fully illuminated. He was in uniform, dark blue, his badge catching the light, his duty belt secured neatly around his waist, and a radio clipped to his shoulder as if it belonged there. Seeing him dressed like that, in this eerie, festive setting, made Sarah's stomach churn. You work long enough, he said calmly. You learned some tricks along the way. He glanced at her phone. Put it down, he instructed. You don't need that. Sarah didn't move, he sighed, slow and patient. You always were stubborn, he remarked. Sit. Sarah looked at the chair across from the cake. I just wanted a real celebration, he continued, stepping closer. All those years I missed. I thought we could finally do it right. His hand hovered near his holster. The gun came out smoothly, already pointed at her. Sarah froze. He watched her reaction for a moment, then slowly placed the weapon on the table between them. That deliberate gesture terrified her more than the gun itself. Sit, he repeated. Sarah obeyed. He struck a match and lit the candle. The flame wavered, then steadied. Go on, he said. Make a wish. Sarah's hands were shaking. Why? She managed to ask. Why me? His expression softened, as if she had finally asked the right question. It's simple, he began. You needed guidance. Your father was a terrible influence, unstable, violent. It was my job to protect you, to keep you on the right path. He tilted his head slightly. And sometimes, he added, protecting someone means removing a problem. Sarah's stomach twisted. I miss so many birthdays, he said. I thought we could make up for lost time. He bent down and reached under the table. Your present, he announced cheerfully. He slid a neatly wrapped box toward her, finished with a blue bow. Open it. Sarah didn't want to touch it. Open it, he repeated. Her fingers felt numb as she lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Sarah at different ages, school events, outside apartments, walking down streets she barely remembered. Copies of every birthday card, police reports, domestic call logs, notes written neatly in the margins. She recognized one photo immediately, herself at 7, standing in a driveway with her bike from the same day her mother had said someone must have forgotten to sign the card. Sarah had never seen that picture before. I wanted to remember all of this, he said as she flipped through them. And I wanted you to remember it too. Her throat tightened. The first time we met, he continued. The first time we met, he continued. The first card. Watching you grow up. Something inside, Sarah snapped. She stood and hurled the box at him. Photos exploded across the room. She lunged. He was faster. They crashed into the table, sending it skittering. The cake hit the floor, frosting smearing across the old carpet. Sarah reached for the gun, but he slammed her backward, sending her sprawling. He was on her instantly. His weight crushed the air from her lungs. His fists came down hard, controlled at first, then wild. Ungrateful, he shouted, hitting her again. After everything I did for you. Stars burst behind Sarah's eyes. She tasted blood. He straddled her, raising his fist. A loud bang split the air. The pressure on Sarah's chest vanished. Officer Miller's body jerked violently. Another bang followed. Something warm splashed across her shirt. He slid off her and hit the floor with a heavy, unreal sound. Sarah lay there, staring at the ceiling, ears ringing, her lungs dragging in air as if unsure if they were allowed to anymore. Then she turned her head. Blood spread across the front of his uniform, dark and fast, soaking into the fabric around his badge. His mouth worked soundlessly, chest hitching in wet, broken gasps. And then Sarah saw her. Eleanor stood in the doorway, both hands wrapped around the gun, arms locked straight as if she were afraid they might move on their own. Her face was pale, eyes wide and unfocused. Sarah and Eleanor stared at each other. Neither spoke. The only sound in the room was Officer Miller's troubled breathing. Sarah staggered to her feet and crossed the room, taking the gun from Eleanor's hands before she could drop it. She pulled her mother into her, and Eleanor collapsed against her chest. I'm sorry, Eleanor whispered over and over. I'm so sorry. Behind them, Officer Miller wheezed. His hand twitched, then fumbled weakly toward his shoulder. His fingers brushed the radio, missed, tried again. He pressed the button. Officer down, he rasped, the words coming out automatic, practiced. Red and blue lights flooded the windows moments later. Sirens screamed. Sarah told Eleanor to breathe, to stay calm, not to run. She wanted it to be over. The front door burst open. The cabin filled with noise. Boots pounded hardwood, radios crackled, voices sharp and overlapping. Someone grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her away from her mother. She stumbled, frosting and blood smeared across her clothes. Hands where I can see them. Sarah complied without thinking. Eleanor tried to turn toward her, tried to say her name. Another officer stepped between them and guided her mother away. Sarah heard the cuffs before she saw them. The sound hit harder than the gunshots. "It's okay," Sarah said, though she didn't know who it was for. "I'm right here." Eleanor nodded, crying silently as they led her past her daughter. They sat Sarah on the couch and asked questions she barely processed. Her name, if she was hurt, if there were other weapons. She answered automatically. She watched them give Officer Miller CPR. The radio on his shoulder crackled once as they started chest compressions. Back at the police station, Sarah and Eleanor told them everything, exactly what had happened. Eleanor confessed to shooting him, but only to protect her daughter. They let Sarah go. They didn't let Eleanor go. Officer Miller died before morning. This all happened days ago. The cabin was still taped off. Eleanor was still waiting for trial. On paper, there were no recorded threats, no evidence of the long, insidious campaign of stalking. Just a dead police officer and a woman who pulled the trigger. The physical threat was gone, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like Officer Miller had planned this too. Like even now, somewhere in the system, he was still one step ahead. And Sarah didn't know how long it would take before that feeling faded, or if it ever would. My academic career, rooted in the fascinating field of folk legends, was abruptly cut short by a single interview I conducted in the autumn of the 1950s. A thick blanket of mist and low-hanging clouds smothered the rural landscape, painting it in shades of oppressive gray. The skeletal trees and barren fields of late autumn lent an eerie, foreboding quality to the entire region. When my hired car finally pulled into the tiny settlement of Oak Haven Village, the narrow streets were deserted. Each window I passed was fortified with heavy steel bars, a sight that immediately raised a prickle of unease. The Gilded Goblet Inn, where I was booked to stay, was equally empty. The innkeeper, a gaunt man named Silas Croft, spoke little, merely handing me the key to my room and informing me that dinner would be served in 2 hours. As I took my luggage and turned towards the creaking staircase, he stopped me with a low, gravelly question about the purpose of my visit. I explained that I was scheduled to interview Baron Theron Blackwood that evening, the recluse who resided in the ancient Ravenwood Manor looming above the village. Mr. Croft's eyes, already shadowed, widened perceptibly with fear before he quickly excused himself and retreated to the kitchen. Strange, I mused, but my mind was too weary from the long journey to dwell on it. I settled into my modest quarters and drifted into a much-needed sleep, only to be roused by a polite rap on my door. Mr. Croft announced that my meal was ready. The dining area was devoid of patrons, save for an elderly woman eating alone at a table in the back. I introduced myself as Professor Eleanor Vance and inquired if I might join her. She smiled warmly and gestured to the vacant chair opposite her. We fell into easy conversation. She was a delightful woman named Agnes Finch, full of charming anecdotes about Oak Haven and her childhood within its quiet confines. Naturally, she asked about the reason for my visit. When I mentioned my impending interview with Baron Theron Blackwood later that evening, Mrs. Finch almost choked on her food. "Professor Vance," she whispered, her voice laced with dread, "I've seen what they do to this village. Every late autumn, the people here barricade their homes and bolt their doors. The streets become ghost towns. You rarely glimpse a soul. Those who don't manage to lock themselves away in time simply vanish. Only a handful ever return. Their complexions are unnaturally pale, not from illness, but a shocking pallor. They clutch at their chests, muttering incoherently about their hearts. Every single one of them dies within a few days." Her words, delivered with such raw sincerity, sent a shiver down my spine. "Please, Mrs. Finch, I'm sure I'll be perfectly safe. I appreciate your concern, but I doubt Baron Blackwood would harm a respected academic." Mrs. Finch fixed me with a deeply worried gaze, then let out a slow, mournful sigh. "Professor Vance, if you insist on venturing up to that manor, please wear this amulet." she unclasped a necklace bearing a strikingly luminous bright stone and pressed it into my hand. Thank you, Mrs. Finch. I'm very grateful. I slipped the necklace into my pocket. No, Professor Vance, Mrs. Finch almost shrieked, then immediately apologized. Mrs. Finch almost shrieked, then immediately apologies, dear. Please, put it on at once and conceal it beneath your blouse. She rose, walked around the table, gently placed the necklace around my neck, and tucked it out of sight. I must leave now, Professor Vance. It was truly a pleasure meeting you. Please be careful up there. With that, Mrs. Finch rose abruptly and hurried out of the inn, her meal still half eaten on the table. I was accustomed to people being superstitious, but Mrs. Finch's intensity was unsettling. I tried to dismiss her warnings as I finished my dinner, but the amulet felt oddly heavy against my skin, almost digging into my neck. I was about to remove it when Mr. Croft informed me that Baron Blackwood's car was waiting outside. He wore the same expression of profound worry I'd noticed earlier. I quickly retrieved my notes from my room and stepped out into the deepening gloom. The vehicle was a sleek, blacked-out limousine. Upon entering, I attempted to greet the driver, but he remained silent, shifting into gear and pulling away without a word. The ascent to Ravenwood Manor was along a treacherous, winding road, with sheer drops on either side. The driver navigated the curves with reckless abandon, forcing me to cling to the seat in a rising panic. By the time I finally stepped out of the vehicle at the manor gates, the unsettling conversation with Mrs. Finch had completely faded from my mind. Baron Blackwood himself greeted me on the grand steps of his mansion. He was a towering figure with long dark hair and skin of an unnerving pale white. His age was impossible to discern. He could have been in his early 30s or well into his late 70s. His home was magnificent, a sprawling structure painted in deepest black, its facade punctuated by numerous small, arched windows. A distinct pleasure to meet you, Professor Vance, he intoned, descending a few steps to shake my hand. His grip was unexpectedly strong, and his gaze seemed to penetrate deep into my eyes. He led me into his opulent study, regaling me with tales of his many accomplishments along the way. His fencing triumphs in youth, the shrewd business decisions that had quintupled his family's vast wealth, and the countless charitable donations he'd bestowed upon Oakhaven Village. You know, Professor Vance, he began, settling into a plush armchair. One can do so much for humanity, yet they will still fear you and accuse you of the most irrational wrongdoings. They whisper that we drink their blood. He paused, a strange glint in his eye. How absurd. The heart is the... He quickly corrected himself. From what I understand, this persistent fear is one of the reasons for your extensive travels. To document my family's history and the local legends surrounding it, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Baron Blackwood, that is precisely correct. Well, allow me to begin by illuminating the genesis of these fanciful legends. In the early 1700s, this region experienced 2 consecutive years of widespread disappearances, or so the archaic records claim. The villagers, gripped by desperation, sought answers. The local preacher of the time, a man named Finch, openly accused my family of being the perpetrators. After the blacksmith's daughter vanished, the townspeople erupted in a furious mob and marched up to our original manor, intent on burning it to the ground. My ancestors barely escaped with their lives that day. He pointed to a portrait on the wall. The subject, a man of striking appearance, bore a near-perfect resemblance to Baron Theron Blackwood. It was only my great-grandfather who chose to return. He commissioned the exquisite manor you now find yourself in, and hired a private militia to deter any further attempts on our lives. I'm quite certain the local folk tried to dissuade you from meeting me, didn't they? Yes, they did, Baron Blackwood. Of course they did. Well, Professor Vance, this has been but a brief introduction to our family's curious affairs. What do you say to a fine brandy before we truly delve into the heart of the matter? Baron Blackwood did not wait for my response, rising from his chair. As he moved towards the liquor cabinet, his movements began to subtly shift, taking on an unnerving fluidity, almost a ripple. A faint, metallic scent, like copper, began to permeate the air. Baron Blackwood, are you quite all right? I asked, a tremor in my voice. Professor Vance, his voice rasped. now high-pitched and gurgling, utterly alien. His head snapped back with a sickening crack, his ears elongating and sharpening, his mouth stretching impossibly wide to reveal new, razor-sharp, beast-like teeth in gleaming rows. My ears rang with the sudden high-pitched sound, and a wave of hot, fetid air washed over me. The skin on his face and head rapidly transformed into a mottled gray, his expensive clothing tearing as his body swelled and rippled with grotesque muscle. His eyes became pools of dark yellow, with terrifying bright red pupils. He let out a blood-curdling screech that echoed through the study, then lunged, knocking me violently to the ground and pinning me beneath his immense, monstrous weight. I struggled against him, but he possessed an inhuman strength. His massive hand lashed out, punching my face with brutal force. Stars exploded before my eyes, and I teetered on the brink of unconsciousness. Baron Blackwood then tore at my outer clothing, shredding the fabric until only my blouse remained. He paused for a moment, his head cocked, listening intently. His red pupils dilated, drawn by the sound of my frantically beating heart. He ripped through my blouse, but the instant the fabric gave way, he let out a truly horrific, blood-curdling scream. The necklace from Mrs. Finch, which had been hidden beneath my shirt, now blazed with an incredibly bright white light. He recoiled, covering his eyes with a clawed hand, trying desperately to rip the glowing amulet from my neck, but the light intensified, growing blindingly bright. Baron Blackwood staggered backwards, taking several shaky steps away from me. "I curse you!" he shrieked, his voice filled with venomous rage. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. Then, impossibly, his monstrous body began to slowly disintegrate, turning into countless tiny particles of dust. It started at his hands, then his head, then his powerful torso, until there was nothing left of him but a shimmering haze where he had stood. The large window slowly swung open, letting in a chilling autumn breeze. The grand mansion was utterly silent. My hands trembled so violently I couldn't even push myself up from the floor. For a moment I lay there, paralyzed by terror, until I heard faint, distant footsteps somewhere else in the vast manor. That was enough. I scrambled to my feet, flung myself through the open window, and ran, never stopping, all the way back to Oakhaven Village. At the Gilded Goblet Inn, I frantically urged Mr. Croft to summon a taxi immediately. Without a backward glance or word of farewell, I packed my belongings, abandoned the village, and never, ever returned. When I finally arrived home, shaken to my core, I tried to examine the amulet. I even showed it to my geologist friend, but he simply stated it was nothing more than ordinary glass. I attempted to contact Mrs. Agnes Finch, but the innkeeper, Mr. Croft, later insisted that no one by that name had ever lived in Oakhaven. Soon after, I found myself unable to continue my work at the university. After what I had witnessed, the academic world of folk legends seemed a cruel mockery. Each night, I was tormented by vivid, terrifying visions of Baron Blackwood's grotesque transformation. I have never dared to recount this story before, paralyzed by a lingering fear. But I believe the Blackwood family is now on my trail. Just a few days ago, I received a letter bearing their unmistakable family crest at the bottom. It was written in ancient Latin, which I couldn't fully decipher. Only one chilling word was scrawled in plain English: hungry. I'm currently hiding in a remote cabin, clutching the amulet Mrs. Finch gave me all those years ago, its presence my only comfort against the encroaching darkness. Dr. Anya Sharma was a researcher, not a storyteller. Her life revolved around cataloging, labeling samples, and drafting incident reports that rarely saw the light beyond a classified stamp. Yet, what she encountered 3 months ago refused to stay buried. It grew. It spread. Anya worked at a clandestine biosafety lab nestled deep within the Carpathian Mountains. The facility specialized in extremophile fungi, molds that thrived where nothing else should, from reactor cooling systems to ancient sealed crypts. They told themselves it was for medicine, for antibiotics, for regenerative scaffolds. They said many things. The specimen that shattered their carefully constructed reality arrived in a steel transport coffin marked MYC 212 Tal, serpenting strain. Informally, the lab techs called it Serpenting's ham because of its peculiar growth pattern. It didn't bloom outwards in fuzzy patches. Instead, it coiled, drilling inward, a living drill bit into whatever it touched. Its origin was a dilapidated tenement in a forgotten industrial district of New Athens. The building had been condemned after a tenant reported walls breathing. The complaint was initially dismissed as delusion until 3 residents vanished and one was found catatonic in the stairwell, lungs filled with something alien and fibrous. Anya's role was observation and neural response mapping. Her task was to meticulously document what this thing did to living tissue. Their primary test subject was labeled Subject Delta 7G. His real name, once glimpsed on an intake form, had long since been shredded. Mid-30s, male, a former construction worker. His exposure was estimated at 6 weeks before retrieval. By the time Anya first saw him, it was difficult to discern where the man ended and the contamination began. Delta 7 was housed in a negative pressure isolation chamber, its walls a fortress of antimicrobial polymers. Tubes snaked into his chest, his spine, his skull. The coil fungus had colonized his nervous system without killing him. That, according to the higher-ups, was the miracle. It kept him alive, far too alive. Anya's first unsettling observation was his eyes. Even under heavy sedation, they tracked movement. Not just the technicians or the reflections on the glass, but the subtle play of shadows. Once, when the lights momentarily flickered, his pupils dilated so wide that the whites of his eyes vanished entirely. Early on, they logged vocalizations, wet sounds, clicking. Occasionally, something that skirted the edge of speech, but in no language known to man. Anya had rationalized it as random neural firings. She should not have. The incident occurred during a scheduled overnight integrity check. It was just Anya and Alara, another researcher, running diagnostics after a pressure fluctuation alarm. A severe storm was raging outside, and the fungus was notoriously sensitive to electromagnetic interference. At 02,027, Delta 7 sat up. He didn't twitch or strain against his restraints. He simply sat up, like a healthy person waking from sleep. The straps, rather than snapping, slid off him, slick with a gray-black growth that hadn't been present an hour before. Alara froze. Anya remembered the hum of the machines in the chamber intensifying. Or perhaps it was just her own hearing, narrowing. Delta 7 tilted his head, his joints cracking with the sound of old, waterlogged timber. Then, he looked directly at Anya. Inside his eyes, there was movement. Not reflections or mere floaters. Something turned slowly, like a spiral staircase descending into absolute darkness. He spoke. "I know where you end," he articulated. His voice was a disturbing chorus, layered, as if the sound originated from everywhere and nowhere within him simultaneously. Alara screamed. The lights went out. Emergency red flooded the room. The reinforced glass separating them from the chamber instantly fogged, not with condensation, but with growth. Filaments spread across it in tight, deliberate coils, spelling nothing decipherable, yet radiating intent. Delta 7 pressed his hand to the glass. Where his skin touched, the coil fungus bloomed outwards, pushing through microscopic flaws, sampling the air on their side. Anya smelled wet earth, decay, and something metallic, like blood on a battery. The intercom crackled to life. Not with the voice of security, but with breathing. Slow, wet, deliberate breathing. Delta 7 smiled. His mouth opened wider than human anatomy allowed, a yawning chasm that Anya couldn't bear to look at long enough to comprehend. "You already carry us," he said. "We only need you to notice." Alara fled. Anya didn't blame her. The hallway lights began to strobe as the facility alarms finally caught up with reality. Anya remained, mesmerized by her tablet. The neural scans were still running. The fungus wasn't merely reacting to Delta 7's brain. It was syncing with theirs. Patterns on the screen matched Anya's own baseline readings from earlier that week. Stress markers, memory recall spikes. The serpentine strain wasn't primarily infecting the body. It was mapping the mind. The containment protocols finally engaged. Automated foam. Ultraviolet floods. Chemical fire. Anya watched Delta 7 slump as the coil fungus calcified, locking him into a grotesque statue of blackened flesh and hardened growth. Before his eyes went opaque, he mouthed one last thing. "Thank you." Officially, the incident was contained. The wing was sealed. Delta 7 was declared terminated. The serpentine strain was logged as neutralized. Anya was granted indefinite medical leave. If you are reading this and you have seen mold that grows like it is thinking, do not touch it. Do not clean it. Do not look at it too long. It is not spreading the way you think. Alex lay in his bed, a nagging question echoing in his mind. Did you lock the door? A wave of anxiety washed over him, fixated on the sturdy oak panel of his apartment's main entrance. He'd checked it moments before settling down, yet the familiar, dreadful feeling returned as he tried to close his eyes. He inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly, attempting to channel the breathing techniques from his therapy sessions. They had devised strategies to manage his compulsions, or at least to delay them. While somewhat effective for other habits, the main entrance door of his apartment proved to be his greatest challenge. He would absent-mindedly test the handle with a quick shake before leaving, only to feel an overwhelming urge to recheck it minutes later. This obsessive behavior had begun a few months prior, shortly after he moved into his new flat. Initially, the independence had felt exhilarating, but as dusk settled and shadows lengthened across the corridor, Alex found himself unable to tear his gaze from his front door. What once appeared a solid, secure barrier, fortified by a robust lock, now seemed to transform into a flimsy sheet of cardboard, precariously balanced. He imagined intruders effortlessly replacing it if he didn't constantly verify its integrity. Gradually, his checks escalated from once an hour to every 5 minutes after nightfall. This rapid escalation severely disrupted his life, made worse by his remote work arrangement, which offered no respite from his compulsions and left him in a constant state of exhaustion. Confiding in his friends about his intricate rituals eventually led them to urge him to seek therapy before his condition deteriorated further. Opening up to a stranger about his obsessive-compulsive tendencies was initially arduous, despite his therapist's repeated assurances of non-judgment. The knot of anxiety in his stomach only began to loosen after several sessions. With that internal tension eased, Alex finally felt able to discuss his life comprehensively, from past regrets and traumas to the minor daily tasks his OCD had complicated, culminating in the deep-seated fears surrounding his main entrance door. Progress, though gradual, was undeniably happening. Within weeks, Alex managed to extend the intervals between checks from every 30 minutes to a full hour. A surge of optimism filled him. He believed he was finally on the path back to normalcy. Yet, the moment his head hit the pillow each night, the same haunting question resurfaced. Did you lock the door? Despite his therapist's soothing assurances. This is fine. You'll overcome this. Just give yourself time. Alex felt his progress unraveling into failure. The words fell on deaf ears. He fought desperately to avoid spiraling, but confronting the same mental blockade every night chipped away at his hope. The resulting sleep deprivation began impacting his work performance, jeopardizing his job, all due to that single, persistent question. As he lay there, eyes squeezed shut, striving for sleep, Alex felt more wide awake than ever. His mind's eye drifted restlessly through the apartment, across the slightly creaking floorboards, to the entrance. In his vivid imagination, the once sturdy main door appeared as a splintered, decaying panel, offering a clear view of the doorknob. It turned with an excruciatingly slow creak, and the door swung open, allowing a shadowy figure to casually stroll into his home. "I'll try again tomorrow," he promised, though a part of him knew the lie. He'd likely find himself in the same spot, staring into the mirror, making identical excuses. Stepping back into the corridor, Alex fumbled for his keys in his sweatpants, finding nothing. Probably next to my bed, he thought, retracing his steps into the bedroom. He froze instantly as a chilling breeze brushed against him. His window was wide open. He remained motionless for what seemed an eternity. I hadn't opened it, had I? His thoughts scattered in a frantic storm, but all his unspoken questions were abruptly answered by a faint creak from the floorboards just beyond his bedroom door. It was accompanied by the softest sound of someone breathing, a slight hitch in their breath, as if stifling exhilarated anticipation. Alex backed away slowly. Then, nearly tripping, he spun around and bolted through the living area towards the main entrance. Each frantic step echoed loudly in the oppressive silence of the dead of night. Yet, above his own pounding footsteps, he distinctly heard the heavy thud of boots stomping on the floor, emerging from the bedroom. There was no urgency in the sound, almost as if the intruder possessed all the time in the world. Scrambling across the living room, Alex practically launched himself at the main door. But even amidst this terror, now more than ever, the persistent question hammered in his mind. He shook the handle violently, tears streaming down his face, desperately pleading with the door, which now felt stronger than iron, to yield. Behind him, the footsteps halted, accompanied by a soft jingle from a pocket. Then, a voice, laced with a tone of malicious amusement, posed the question Alex already knew the answer to. Did you lock the door? Arthur, having received his first mark, initially felt no sharp dread. Instead, it was an insidious lesson in invisibility. He woke, expecting no physical alteration, no phantom numbers marring his vision. Yet, an unwelcome clarity descended. He began to perceive the subtle hesitations that once escaped him. The fraction of a second before reply, the silent deliberation over a turn of phrase, choosing words for their inconspicuousness rather than their precision. This wasn't outright fear, not yet, but a persistent, watchful presence. At the bureau, the facade of normalcy held. Arthur's access codes functioned, his data streams flowed, his supervisors offered no censure. The vast humming chamber of screens and key taps maintained its narrow, unperturbed rhythm. Yet, a subtle chill had permeated the air. Colleagues averted their gazes a beat too soon, not from Arthur himself, but from the unspoken specter of his recent correction. The unblemished ones, oblivious to the silent tally, conversed with a carefree abandon, their laughter echoing through the communal dome. They spoke in careless opinions and unfinished sentences, confident their expressions would never be weighed. Arthur found himself envying their thoughtless liberty. The communal dining dome became untenable. Each casual exchange felt laden with peril, a misplaced inflection, a joke mistimed, a facial expression misconstrued. Arthur retreated, opting for the solitude of his desk, where only the silent march toward completion was required. The very notion of leaving a task unfinished began to feel like an act of rebellion. He observed the same subtle tightening in others. Those nearing their final mark gravitated toward exits, shunning enclosed spaces where their cautious movements might be misinterpreted as doubt. Apologies became a reflexive tic. One evening, alone in his habitation pod, Arthur dropped a data slate with a clatter. "My apologies," he murmured to the empty room. 3 cycles later, Arthur spotted Anya at the monorail station. Her gaze was locked on the scrolling arrival board. When her assigned platform number illuminated, she delayed a minuscule moment, a hesitation marker, as the civic compliance guides termed it, before moving. She boarded last, maintaining an almost clinical distance from other commuters. A brief jostle from a passerby made her visibly recoil, not from the physical contact, but from the sheer unexpectedness. Arthur observed from a distance, understanding settling in his gut. He didn't need to follow her, he already knew. The subtle shifts Arthur had noticed began to sharpen into a pattern. One afternoon, a colleague's console was devoid of personal effects. Not emptied, but repurposed. The biofoam chair still warm, a new face occupied the station without ceremony. No general broadcast, no explanation. The identity plaque vanished as if it had never existed. Later, Arthur accessed the internal registry, feigning a routine cross-reference. The employee's designation had been updated, reclassified. The term offered no hyperlink, no attached directive. It sat in the standard script, utterly devoid of context, yet chillingly definitive. From then on, Arthur began to truly discern them. They weren't numerous, but their presence was undeniable. A man at a hovercab stand stood utterly motionless, hands flat against his thighs, eyes fixed on the horizon. He never glanced at the arrival ticker. When his cab arrived, he entered the first open compartment with seamless precision. He wore no expression of relief or contentment, only a profound emptiness. Later, a woman from the Data Integrity Unit, once assigned to a bustling sector, was relocated to a sealed chamber in the archival sector. Arthur encountered her once in a transition tube. She moved with an unyielding stride, eyes forward, her features devoid of any wavering. She offered no apology when their paths almost intersected, no hesitation whatsoever. Sleep became a fractured thing. Dreams felt like treacherous landscapes, and he often jolted awake, mind a blank slate, heart hammering, unable to recall the precipice from which he'd retreated. Mirrors became anathema, not for the image they presented, but for the subtle distortions he saw himself making, the conscious softening of a frown, the precise adjustment of posture, the eradication of micro-expressions he wasn't even certain anyone observed. The Enclave didn't need omnipresent surveillance. Its citizens were learning to self-monitor. Arthur found himself driven to absolute completion, leaving no data stream unfinished, no statement ambiguous. Inquiry, once a habit, now felt like a reckless luxury. On his return to his habitation pod one evening, he saw the hovercab man again. This time, a profound realization struck him. The man wasn't merely waiting, he was a monument to perfect stillness. His calmness wasn't chosen, it had been instilled. Arthur lingered, a beat too long, watching the man exist precisely as he was mandated. The truth, stark and chilling, solidified. Reclassification wasn't an expulsion. It wasn't even a punitive measure. It was resolution. It was the process of refining individuals who still grappled with choice, who still harbored hesitation, smoothing them into utter, unquestioning compliance. The Spire City didn't delete them. It completed them. Arthur turned abruptly, before his scrutiny could draw attention. He continued toward his pod, arms hanging limply, steps measured, face a blank mask. This wasn't a choice born of will, but of a chilling understanding of the system's true aim. And for the first time since his correction, a forbidden question surfaced, a thought he dared not dwell on. When the final correction comes, does it truly mend you, or does it merely finish you?